Okay, I want to start simple. Close your eyes. Imagine a feeling you had this week. One that you couldn't explain. Not to your closest family and friends, not even to yourself. That feeling, that's how some of the world's greatest poets found their calling. The tiny chaos inside of you is a spark. When given proper oxygen and fuel, that spark becomes a flame. That flame is what we call poetry. Poetry is just symbols, metaphors, big words, imagery, right? Or is it? If poetry was just metaphors, then the Pulitzer Committee should honestly stop ignoring my notes app. It's peak, unhinged brilliance. Unfortunately, poetry is a mirror. A very honest one. Sometimes too honest. My notes app would come under that description. Anyway, so many poets have used this mirror. Rumi called it a guest house, where every emotion walks in uninvited. Maya Angelou turned pain into her words, I rise. Sylvia Plath looked in it and saw herself and her whole identity staring back. When we read poetry, we're not decoding a secret message. Don't believe what your teachers tell you. Sometimes blue curtains are just blue curtains. What we're actually doing is recognizing ourselves in someone else's words. I'm going to, tell you, say a stanza out to you guys, and I want you to think about how it feels. This is my prayer to thee, my Lord. Strike at the root of penury in my heart. Give me the strength to bear my joys and sorrows. Give me the strength to make my love fruitful in service. Was it vulnerability, inner restlessness, or something else entirely? That was a poem from Tagore's Gitanjali. In that poem, at least some of us discovered ourselves in someone else's words. The soul doesn't always speak in full sentences. Sometimes it needs enjambment. Okay, so why does poetry feel so personal? The reason it feels so personal is that it is so personal. The poet is saying, I felt this. Maybe you did too. That's what I'll be talking about today. How to interact with poetry. Not like a school assignment, because God knows I have enough of those, but like a conversation with your own soul. So who's ready to hear what your soul has to say? Most people don't actually hate poetry. They're just afraid of it. Somewhere along the way, poetry stopped becoming something we understood and started to become something we had to get right. We were trained to ask questions like, what does the poet mean? What is the symbol? What is the metaphor? And, poetry became less like listening to a person and more like diffusing a time bomb in a movie. One wrong interpretation and boom. 5 marks gone. Self-esteem gone. Love for poetry gone. So we stopped trusting ourselves. We stopped trusting our reactions. We started believing that meaning lives in answer keys, not inside us. Why do people find poetry so intimidating? The fear of poetry is called meterophobia. And a lot of us face it because humans like to have knowledge of what they're facing. But poetry is very, very confusing. So most of us just can't figure it out. That's why we find it intimidating. But poetry was never meant to be intimidating. It was meant to be close, personal, a little uncomfortable. That's why poems, no one sits down to write poems thinking, I hope this becomes question 3B in an English final exam paper. They write because something's bothering them. Something feels heavy. Something refuses to stay quiet. That's why poems feel unfinished, why they break suddenly, why they don't explain themselves properly. Because emotions don't explain themselves properly either. If you read a poem and feel confused, that doesn't mean that you failed as a reader, it means the poem is doing its job. Poetry is not asking you to solve it. It's asking you to feel something and not run away from it immediately. And once you stop trying to prove that you understand poetry and start letting it affect you, that's when you start interacting with poetry. So, then you notice something else. Different poems do very different things to you. Take Rumi. In the guest house, he talks about emotions as guests who joy, sadness, anger, regret, all ringing the doorbell at the worst possible time. He does not tell you to throw them out. He says, let them in, offer them tea, let them stay until they leave on their own. Suddenly, emotions don't feel like weaknesses anymore. They feel temporary. They feel human. Now, take Maya Angelou. When she writes I rise, she's not gently sitting with pain, she's standing up to it. The repetition is not there to sound poetic, it's there to sound stubborn. Every time she says it, the line gets stronger. And somehow, you do too. Then there's Sylvia Plath. In Mirror, she shows you the harsh truth without soft lighting or filters. Reading it feels uncomfortable, like accidentally opening your front camera. But that discomfort, that's the point. Poetry is not always meant to heal you. Sometimes it's meant to show you what you've been avoiding. Notice how none of these poets are doing the same thing. One accepts emotion, one fights back, one confronts herself. There's no single correct way to write poetry, which means, good news, there's no single correct way to read it. What matters is what happens when the poem meets you. So here's my favorite way to interact with poetry. First, notice your reaction. Before asking what the poem means, ask, what did it do to you? Second, sit with confusion. Poetry is one of the few places where not understanding is allowed. And third, connect, don't conclude. You don't need a final answer. You just need one moment where the poem brushes up against your life. Because once you stop trying to finish a poem and start letting it stay unfinished inside you, you stop reading poetry, you start interacting with it. Poetry survives because emotions don't expire. Wordsworth wrote about daffodils 200 years ago. On paper, it's just a walk. Flowers, nature, calm vibes, like a Pinterest mood board. But the poem is actually about memory, about how joy comes later when it's not expected, but when you need it most. Langston Hughes does the exact opposite. In Dreams, he strips everything down. No metaphors doing gymnastics. Life without dreams becomes broken-winged, barren, simple, direct, uncomfortable. That's why it works. And across languages and cultures, you see the same thing. Tagore, Hughes, Rumi, Wordsworth, Fez. Different lives, different words, same feelings. You know, Fez once wrote, "Dil now meet to nahi, na kaam hi to hai. Gham ki shaam hai to kya, shaam hi to hai." The heart is not hopeless, just unfinished. So what if it is an evening of sadness? It's just an evening. And that line understands this better than most people do. So I'm going to stop explaining poetry right now and I'm going to give it back to you. So this is a poem I wrote and I don't want you to analyze or judge it. I just want you to listen to it and, think about how it feels. When life traps me in a well-woven cage of lies and betrayal, of sadness and pain, I take a deep breath and I remember it's woven from thread. It's not a real cage. It can be unraveled and I'll be okay. If that poem stayed with you, even a little, then you already know how to interact with poetry because it's not something you master. It's something you meet and sometimes it quietly meets you back. Thank you.